When my daughter told me I'd embarrassed her in front of her in-laws, I nodded, picked up my coat, and left without a word. 3 days later, I had a courier at my door serving me legal papers. Before I get into it, let me know which city you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever poured your whole life into a child who mistook your patience for weakness, hit that like button now, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. My name is Walter Pierce. I'm 64 years old. For 36 years, I ran maintenance operations for a regional water utility, the kind of job nobody thinks about until the pipes fail. I retired 18 months ago with a pension, a paid-off house, and a habit I never managed to break. I check everything twice. I read every line of every document before I sign it. I test every assumption before I trust it. That habit, more than anything else, is the reason my daughter is currently sitting in a room with her attorney trying to explain herself to a judge. Her name is Renata. She's 31. She married a man named Trevor Ashby 4 years ago. And from the very first dinner I had with his family, I understood exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. Old money, or at least money old enough to have forgotten what it felt like not to have it. Trevor's father owns a chain of orthodontic clinics across 3 counties. His mother sits on the board of a private school foundation and mentions it within the first 10 minutes of any conversation. They are the kind of family that says, "We don't really do gifts, we do experiences," while looking at you like you're supposed to apologize for bringing a wrapped box to Christmas. I never disliked Trevor. I want to be clear about that from the start, because this isn't a story about a father who hated his son-in-law on sight. Trevor was polite, distant, but polite. What I disliked, slowly and then all at once, was what my daughter became around his family. Renata grew up doing her own laundry at 14 because I worked double shifts and believed in self-sufficiency. She used to fix her own bike chain. She used to laugh loud enough that neighbors could hear her through closed windows. Around the Ashbys, she got quiet. She got careful. She started apologizing for things that weren't her fault, the way people do when they're afraid of being found lacking. 3 weeks before Christmas, Renata called to invite me to a holiday dinner at the Ashby estate, that's the word they use, estate, for a house with a name carved into a stone marker at the end of the driveway. I said I'd be there. I bought gifts for everyone, including Trevor's parents, because that's what I do. I don't show up empty-handed to anyone's table, regardless of how they feel about wrapped boxes. The dinner itself was fine until dessert. Trevor's mother, a woman named Deidre with a laugh like a wine glass being tapped with a spoon, asked me what I did now that I was retired, in a tone that made clear she already assumed the answer was nothing worth mentioning. I told her I did some part-time consulting for the utility, training new hires on infrastructure inspection protocols. She said, "And I remember this precisely. Oh, how practical. The way you'd compliment a child's finger painting." I let it go. I've swallowed worse insults from better people. But then Deidre turned to Renata and asked, in front of the entire table, whether it was true that her father had worked as, and I quote, "some kind of plumber." Renata's face went white. And instead of correcting her mother-in-law, instead of saying one single word in my defense, my daughter laughed a small, nervous, "please don't make this worse" laugh and said, something like that, "Yeah." I finished my meal. I thanked Deidre for her hospitality. I drove home in silence, and I didn't call Renata that night, or the next morning, or the morning after that. 2 days later, she called me, not to apologize, but to tell me I'd made things awkward by leaving early and being, in her words, so sensitive about it. She told me Trevor's family had noticed I seemed uncomfortable, and maybe next time I should try harder to fit in. I said very little on that call. I told her I loved her, that I needed some time, and I hung up. What Renata didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent that entire evening after the dinner sitting at my kitchen table with a folder I'd been avoiding for almost a year. Because here is the piece of this story that Renata forgot in her rush to be embarrassed by her own father. 2 years ago, when Trevor and Renata wanted to buy their first home together, a modest place before they traded up to something closer to the Ashby family compound, they didn't have enough for the down payment. Trevor's parents, despite their orthodontic empire, declined to help, citing some philosophy about children learning to earn their own foundation. So I helped. I gave them $94,000. Not a loan on paper, not a formal note with an interest rate, just a father helping his daughter, because that's what I believed fathers did. I never once brought it up again. Renata never once mentioned it either, not at holidays, not at birthdays, Not during a single one of the dozen conversations where Deidre Ashby made comments about self-sufficiency and family bootstraps while sitting in a house her husband's trust fund built. That night in my kitchen, I made a decision. Not out of spite, though I won't pretend the humiliation of that dinner didn't sting. I made the decision because I finally let myself see something I'd been refusing to see for 2 years. My daughter had let people who never once helped her financially claim credit for a foundation I had personally poured. While I sat at their table and got called a plumber like it was a punchline. I am not a plumber. I spent 36 years reading blueprints for water treatment systems that serve 400,000 people. But that isn't even the point. The point is that I gave my daughter $94,000 and asked for nothing in return except the basic decency of not being erased. The next morning, I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Hutton, who had handled my late wife's estate years earlier and had stayed in my corner ever since. I told her I wanted to know my options regarding a substantial gift I'd given my daughter and her husband, one that had never been formalized. Priscilla asked me a single question. Did I have any documentation at all, bank transfers, texts, anything showing the money moved from me to them? I told her yes. I had the wire transfer confirmation. I had a text message from Renata at the time that said, verbatim, "Dad, you're a lifesaver, we'll pay you back, I promise." I had never asked her to pay it back. I had, foolishly, treated that message as a formality rather than a commitment worth holding on to. But I'd kept it. I keep everything. 36 years of documenting infrastructure failures teaches you that memory lies but paper doesn't. Priscilla told me that without a formal loan agreement, recovering the money as a debt would be difficult, but not impossible, especially with written acknowledgement from Renata that repayment had been promised. She said we could pursue it as an unjust enrichment claim, or, more simply, I could send formal demand for repayment and see how they responded. She also asked me something I hadn't considered. Was my name on the deed to their house in any capacity, given the size of my contribution? It wasn't. I'd never asked. I'd trusted my daughter the way you trust the child you raised to have your back the way you always had hers. I want to pause here and tell you something about patience, because this is where the story slows down, and I need you to sit with me in that slowness the way I had to sit in it myself. I did not call Renata screaming. I did not send an angry text demanding my money. For 11 days, I did nothing but gather information. I requested copies of every transfer. I had Priscilla draft a formal, courteous letter, not a threat, a simple statement of fact outlining the $94,000, the date it was sent, the text message acknowledging it as a loan to be repaid, and a request for a repayment schedule to begin within 30 days. I sent that letter by certified mail on a Tuesday morning. I did not call to warn Renata it was coming. I have spent my whole life reading systems for the moment they're about to fail, and I have learned that warning a failing system rarely prevents the failure. It only gives it time to disguise itself. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Renata called me that evening, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard something other than careful politeness in her voice. I heard fear. She asked me if I was serious. She asked me how I could do this to her, especially now, especially after everything. And I asked her, calmly, what everything she meant, because from where I was sitting, everything had mostly consisted of me giving without asking for anything back, including basic respect. She told me Trevor was furious. She told me his parents had seen the letter apparently Trevor had shown them, which told me a great deal about where the real decisions in that marriage were being made, and that Deidre had called it, and I remember this phrase precisely because Priscilla wrote it into the file, an act of financial elder manipulation designed to control young people through guilt. I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before I responded. Then I told my daughter something I'd been rehearsing quietly for 11 days. I told her that a woman who had never once contributed a single dollar to her son's household did not get to define what manipulation looked like. I told her that $94,000 was not guilt. It was math, plain and documented, the same kind of math I'd spent my career trusting to keep bridges standing and water clean. And I told her that if the Ashbys were so committed to the idea that young people should earn their own foundation, perhaps it was time Trevor and Renata earned the one I had personally paid for. She hung up on me. That was the last civil conversation we had for almost 3 weeks. What happened next moved faster than I expected. And this is the part of the story where the pacing shifts, where things that had been quiet for 11 days suddenly weren't quiet anymore. 4 days after that phone call, Priscilla received a response not from Renata, but from an attorney representing both Trevor and Renata jointly. The letter claimed the $94,000 had been an unconditional gift, citing the absence of a formal loan document, and it went further than I expected. It suggested that my sudden and aggressive demand for repayment, issued so soon after a family gathering where I had allegedly caused a scene, indicated a pattern of using financial leverage to control my daughter's choices, and it hinted, not subtly, that if I continued to pursue this, they would explore whether my mental competency should be evaluated, given my age and what they called erratic recent behavior. I read that letter twice at my kitchen table. In the same chair where I'd made the original decision, I felt something cold settle into my chest, not fear, but recognition. This is a maneuver, I realized. Someone had coached my daughter, or coached Trevor, into a strategy: discredit the aging father before he can be taken seriously, make the story about his stability instead of about the money. I had spent 36 years around engineers and inspectors who tried exactly this kind of thing when an audit found their negligence. Attack the credibility of the person holding the evidence, rather than address the evidence itself. I called Priscilla immediately. I told her I wanted to know exactly what erratic recent behavior could possibly mean, since I had done nothing in the past month except live quietly and send one certified letter. Priscilla, who has represented families through worse than this, told me something that steadied me more than I expected. She said the mental competency threat was almost certainly a bluff meant to frighten me into dropping the claim, because pursuing an actual competency evaluation required far more than a disagreement over money. It required documented evidence of cognitive decline, and I had none because there was none to have. But she also told me something I hadn't considered, something that turned this from a financial dispute into something far more serious. She asked whether I had reviewed my will and my power of attorney documents recently, given that Renata was still listed as my healthcare proxy and secondary financial power of attorney from years earlier, back when things between us were simple. I had not reviewed those documents in almost 6 years. I want you to sit with me in that moment, because this is where the story stopped being about wounded pride and started being about something with real consequences. If Renata and Trevor were coordinating a strategy to paint me as mentally unstable, and if Renata still held legal standing over my healthcare and my finances should anything happen to me, I was not simply a father who'd been embarrassed at a dinner table. I was a man whose own daughter had motive, documentation of an alleged pattern of erratic behavior, and legal authority all lining up in the same direction. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury I stopped affording myself decades ago. The same year, a corroded valve nearly took out an entire treatment facility on my watch and taught me that calm hands save more lives than fast ones. Instead, I asked Priscilla to begin the process of revoking and replacing every legal document that gave Renata any authority over my life, medical or financial, and replacing her with my younger brother, Dennis, a retired Army logistics officer who has never once in 61 years lost his composure in a crisis. I also asked Priscilla to do something else. I asked her to formally request, in writing, that if the Ashby's attorney intended to allege any concerns about my mental competency, they submit those concerns through the appropriate legal channel, a formal petition, rather than implying it as a threat in a private letter. I knew, and Priscilla confirmed, that such a petition would require an independent psychiatric evaluation. So I scheduled one myself, preemptively, with a well-regarded geriatric psychiatrist 2 counties over, entirely on my own initiative, before anyone forced my hand. That evaluation took place on a gray Wednesday morning in early January. It lasted just under 3 hours. 2 weeks later, I received a comprehensive report stating, in language a courtroom would respect, that I demonstrated full cognitive competency, sound judgment, and no evidence whatsoever of any decline consistent with the vague insinuations in that attorney's letter. I had Priscilla file that report, quietly, into a folder that was steadily becoming the most important document collection of my life. While all of this was happening, the calls from Renata had stopped entirely. What replaced them was worse, in its own quiet way. Mutual friends began reaching out, carefully, the way people do when they've been fed one side of a story and are testing whether the other side matches. A woman from my old church group, someone who'd known Renata since she was in diapers, called to check in and mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd heard I was going through something difficult, and that Renata was worried about me. I understood immediately what was happening. My daughter, or the Ashbys, or both, were building a narrative in the community before I'd said a single public word in my own defense. A weak, unstable father being manipulated by grief and loneliness into some irrational financial vendetta against his own child. I did not correct that narrative loudly. I did not post anything online, did not call anyone to defend myself. I have learned that a man defending himself too quickly looks guilty of something, even when he isn't. Instead, I let the story breathe, and I kept building my folder, because I understood, with the same clarity I once used to trace a leak back through 40 miles of pipeline to its exact point of failure, that this would eventually require more than my word. It would require proof. The proof arrived on its own, 3.5 weeks after that first attorney's letter, in the form of a voicemail I never expected. It was from Trevor, not Renata. Trevor calling my personal cell phone at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, his voice thick with something between alcohol and desperation. He didn't know I still had voicemail transcription enabled, a small technical detail he never would have considered because he'd always seen me as the kind of man who could barely operate a smartphone. That assumption cost him. In that voicemail, Trevor told me, rambling and unguarded in a way sober people rarely are, that his parents had pressured him and Renata into the competency threat because Deidre was, in his words, worried the old man might actually win this in court and it'll look bad for the family. He said something else, something that made my hands go cold as I listened to it a second time to be sure I'd heard it correctly. He said his parents had suggested that if I truly did have Renata as my financial power of attorney still on file somewhere, we could just quietly handle things ourselves before he changes it, easier than fighting him for the money. I sat with that voicemail for a long time before I did anything with it, because what Trevor had just admitted, drunk and careless on a Tuesday night, was that the Ashby family had discussed the possibility of using existing legal authority over my finances to simply take control before I could formally revoke it. That is not a family disagreement. That is, as Priscilla confirmed the following morning with a gravity in her voice I hadn't heard from her before, a documented statement suggesting conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, regardless of whether I was, in fact, vulnerable at all. Priscilla moved quickly after that. She filed the new power of attorney documents immediately, formally revoking Renata's authority and instating Dennis in her place, with certified copies sent to my bank, my former employer's pension administrator, and my healthcare providers. So there could be no ambiguity about who held legal standing over my affairs the moment those documents were processed. She also preserved the voicemail through a formal chain of custody, the kind that holds up when someone eventually tries to claim it was taken out of context. 2 days after the paperwork was filed, I finally called Renata myself, not through an attorney, just me, calling my daughter the way a father does when he still loves someone even while he's protecting himself from them. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was small in a way I hadn't heard since she was 19, and calling to tell me she'd failed a class she'd been terrified to tell me about. I told her I knew about the plan to take control of my finances before I could stop it. I told her I had it in Trevor's own voice, preserved, documented, ready. I heard her breathing change on the other end of the line, and then I heard her start to cry. Not performed crying, not the careful kind she'd learned to do at that dinner table, but the real kind, the kind I remembered from when she was small and had genuinely broken something she loved. She told me she hadn't known, not really, not the specifics. She told me Trevor's parents had been the ones pushing hardest, that Trevor had gotten swept up in it because his parents controlled far more of their lives than either of them liked to admit. The mortgage on their current house, a standing arrangement where Deidre and her husband quietly covered Trevor's car payment, an entire architecture of financial dependency that made the $94,000 I'd given them look almost modest by comparison. She told me she was ashamed of the dinner, ashamed of the laugh, ashamed of every quiet moment she let Deidre erase who her father actually was. I did not immediately forgive her. I want to be honest about that, because I think forgiveness handed out too quickly is its own kind of dishonesty. I told her that I loved her, that I had never stopped loving her, but that love and trust are not the same instrument, and she had spent the last several years slowly dismantling the second one while assuming the first would always remain intact regardless. I told her that the $94,000 was no longer just about money. It had become about whether she and her husband, coached or not, had been willing to let his family use my own age against me as a weapon. She asked me what I wanted. And here is where the story turns, where the slow, methodical gathering of documents and voicemails and legal filings finally became something with an actual resolution, rather than just an accumulating case file. I told her I wanted three things. First, a formal, written repayment agreement for the $94,000, with a schedule, with interest, filed and notarized. No more informal family arrangements built on the assumption that blood makes paperwork unnecessary. Second, I wanted her personally, not through an attorney, to write and deliver an apology to me for the dinner, for the laugh, for 4 years of small erasures I had absorbed without ever naming them out loud. And third, I wanted nothing further to do with Deidre and her husband, not out of cruelty, but because a man my age does not have unlimited years left to spend them at tables where he's mocked for how he spent his career keeping people's water clean. Renata agreed to all three quietly, without negotiation. 3 weeks later, a repayment agreement arrived at Priscilla's office, properly notarized, the full $94,000 scheduled to be repaid over 18 months directly from a savings account. Renata had opened separately from any joint account with Trevor, an account, she told me, that the Ashbys didn't know existed. The apology came the following weekend, not a phone call. Renata drove 3 hours to my house, sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd once sat with that folder, deciding what kind of father I was going to be for the rest of this story, and she told me she was sorry in specific, unhurried language for every part of it, not the vague, general kind of sorry people use to end an uncomfortable conversation quickly. As for Trevor's parents, I never spoke to them again. Not out of drama, not with some grand confrontation the way you might expect from a story like this. I simply stopped attending anything where they'd be present, and Renata, to her credit, stopped asking me to. I think about that Christmas dinner sometimes, the sound of Deidre's laugh, the word plumber hanging in the air like she expected me to shrink from it. I don't shrink anymore. I spent 36 years making sure water flowed clean and safe to 400,000 people who never once thought to thank me. And I spent one difficult winter making sure my daughter finally understood that respect isn't something you extend downward toward the people who built your foundation, while looking upward at the people who never lifted a single brick. Last month, I used part of the first repayment installment, along with money I'd been quietly saving for years, to put a down payment on a small cabin 2 hours north, near a lake where I used to take Renata fishing. When she was young enough to still think I hung the moon instead of just plumbing, I invited her up for the first weekend. She came alone, without Trevor, and we sat on the dock in the cold morning air, and she asked me, carefully, the way you ask a question you're not sure you're allowed to ask, whether I could ever really trust her again. I told her the truth. I told her trust isn't something you get back all at once, the way you can wire $94,000 in a single afternoon. It's something you rebuild the way I rebuilt failing systems for 36 years, one verified connection at a time, testing each joint before you put weight on it, never assuming the last repair means the next one won't be needed. She nodded. She understood that better than most people would, because she's my daughter. And somewhere underneath 4 years of learning to shrink herself at someone else's table, she still remembers what it looks like to build something that lasts. If this story reminded you of your own family, of the quiet ways people test how much you'll tolerate before you finally hold your ground, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe love should always come with boundaries attached, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one still to come.